morning, dear friends. We'll start with 3 sounds of the bell. So we invite you to sit upright beautifully. Relax your shoulders, relax your body. And we'll hear the waves moving through the air, not only vibrating our eardrum, but also every cell in our body, inviting us to really wake up to what's going on right here and right now. And we do that by bringing our attention back to our breathing. So you might like to close your eyes and bring all your attention to your in-breath and your out-breath. Breathing in, I'm aware I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I'm aware I'm breathing out. In, out. Good morning, dear respected Thai, dear noble community. Today is the 9th of June, Sunday. We have a day of mindfulness in the year 2024. We're sitting in the Ocean of Peace Meditation Hall in Deer Park Monastery. My name is Thay Phap Luu, and I live here at Deer Park. How many of you are here for the first time? Okay. So the heart of our practice is mindful breathing. So we've been able to enjoy peaceful walking meditation as a community. And now, during the talk, I encourage you to enjoy mindful sitting meditation. It means that we sit beautifully and we enjoy our breathing. We don't need to think about anything, not even what I'm saying. We say we let the words of the talk just enter like the rain entering the dry earth. And it naturally penetrates if there's no obstruction of our thinking, like a tarp that obstructs the rain from entering the earth. We just put down our thinking about the future, about the past, and come back to the present moment, and just allow the words of the Dhamma talk enter the soil of our mind. And the seeds that are already there get touched. That's the beauty of the Dhamma. It's actually already there in us, and we just support each other to touch those good seeds in our consciousness. Our teacher lived a very remarkable life, and he trained his students to be a continuation of that remarkable life. It doesn't mean that we need to go live in a country torn apart by war and then become a monk and then decide that we can find an engaged way to practice in the midst of that war, but rather we look right in the situation that we find ourselves in with awareness and see how we can help heal and transform first our own suffering, and then we get the insight that our own suffering is not separate from the collective suffering that we experience in our communities, in our families, in our workplace, and in our nations and in the world. And that is what we are doing here at Deer Park. That is our path. As monastics, as long-term lay residents, we come to live in this place and practice. Our teacher often said, the only requirement to live in the community is that you have to practice. So you might have a lot of suffering and make yourself suffer and other people suffer around you, but as long as you are practicing, then you have you can continue to live in the community. But once we stop practicing, then there's not really any point to live in a community of practice anymore. So we practice, and what we practice is mindfulness. So we practice to be aware of what's going on in the present moment, in our body, in our mind, in our thinking, in our speech, in our actions. And we observe the cause and effect. So it means when we think something, when we say something, there's a real effect in the world. And we get down into the level of a kind of microscope, like atomic microscope, looking at our own thinking and our own actions of speech and body, and we observe how in this present moment it's like kind of like a quantum wave which is collapsing into the one experience of reality which we are now experiencing. And yet at any moment there are really millions, billions of possibilities of how the next moment can unfold. And what determines how it unfolds is our own actions. And so mindfulness helps us to see at this really fine level of precision how our actions are changing our future. They're changing our own future as an individual. They're changing the future of our family, our friends, our colleagues, our community, and the world. And so Thay got that insight. So Thay studied Buddhist psychology as a young monk, and he thought that he could find there something to help him to understand what was tearing apart brother and sister, family, siblings in his country of Vietnam. During that time, Vietnam was occupied by the French, and Vietnamese people were treated like second-class citizens in their own country by the colonial powers. And people were divided. Some Vietnamese worked for the French government. In fact, Thay's father was an official in the government, involved in land distribution. And so Thay had the chance to go to good schools, and he did very, very well, especially in writing. And yet together with some of his young friends, including his older brother, who became a monk first, they made the commitment to all become monks. One day Thay saw the image of a Buddha on a Buddhist magazine called Duc Tuệ in Vietnam, the flame of insight, correct? So, no, not correct. Yeah, the flame of insight. And Thay saw this radiant peace and calm on the cover of that journal, and he felt so inspired to become a calm, wise person like the Buddha that he saw on the cover of that magazine. And so Thay, although he had the opportunity to be a great, to follow in his father's footsteps, to be a very successful officer of some sort in the government, he decided to leave the home and become a monk. And he was an excellent monk. He learned the sutras and the commentaries and learned classical Chinese and was a kind of apple of his teacher's eye, you might say. And yet as Thay grew in his path as a monk, he saw that it wasn't enough to just be a monk. Many of his generation were joining the resistance to fight against the colonial powers that had occupied the country to help Vietnam gain its independence. And Thay felt that urge too. But fortunately, Thay had good friends who kept him on the spiritual path. Because Thay had that seed of a warrior, like we all have the seed of a warrior within us, who wants to fight for justice, for freedom. And he wanted justice and freedom for his own country. And that is a very noble aspiration. So Thay remained a monk. But he saw that as a monk, he needed to help his country to be free. And so he worked hard as a young monk. He tried to find a way to bring together the Buddhist community as one body, together with many other young intellectuals at that time in the Buddhist community. He tried to find a way to unite the Buddhist community, to find a way that wasn't dependent on outside ideologies, to unify the country. He saw that in the past, Buddhism had unified Vietnam and brought lasting peace during the Li and the Chan dynasties in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries in Vietnam. There were kings, some of them who stepped down from their throne after they helped defend the country in order to become monks. As far as I know, it's the only instance in history where sitting kings actually decided to become monks. In the Li dynasty, the king was raised by the monks, the Li Tai Do, and he took his insight from one monk named Ban Han. And in the Chan dynasty, the king Chan Nhan Dong, after he repelled the Mongol armies 2 times from entering Vietnam in order to quell the violence that he had brought up by raising armies to defend the country, he himself went to the mountain Yên Tu, and he decided to become a monk and pass the kingdom on to his son. So Thay had that deep aspiration, just like those kings in the past in Vietnam, how to go deeply into the Buddhist teachings in order to create a strong, solid foundation for his country that didn't depend on violence. Yeah. We live in a country that mostly based its strength on violence. And I think there's something there in Buddhist teachings that can help transform that deep-rooted energy of violence. So I'd like to talk today about this special convergence of history at which we find ourselves. We have the highest rates of inequality in about a century. And there are people ransacking trains full of Amazon goods going out of Los Angeles and trying to find some kind of valuable item they can resell, leaving all the packages in the midst. There are people living in homelessness, probably near our own houses. And if we look at it in isolation, we can think that there are just people who are not well. And when we look at ourselves in our own mental well-being, we might ask ourselves, is it me? Or is it the conditions in which I am living now that are contributing to this instability? We're facing a climate crisis, and unlike any of the human race has ever seen before. And there is no one person who knows what to do. In the past, we could always rely on one strong leader, and we just follow that person. And either we do what we're told or we don't do what we're told. But it's not so simple anymore. We live in a society which has real inherited wealth that is passed down from generation to generation. And we might like to say that everyone is equal, but that is a fiction. And the reality is quite different. There's inherited wealth, there is intergenerational poverty as well. And so this is all what we can observe with the practice of mindfulness. We can see the reality of what's going on in our own mind, what's going on in our body, and what's going on as well outside. Because we start to see that there's not a separation between inside and outside. That how our mind is also how the collective is. That, as our teacher often said, we can imagine it like a room full of candles. And each candle is our own consciousness. And the light of the one candle illuminates itself. But the collective body of light of all the candles has a greater luminosity. And we cannot distinguish the light of one candle separated from the collective luminosity of all the candles. And that is the same as an image to represent our mind and how our mind is part of the collective mind of our society. And I find that very helpful because I often feel overwhelmed with the suffering in myself. And in my life, I've dealt with depression, I've dealt with strong anger, and even after 20 years of being a monk, I still sometimes feel strong anger. I still sometimes feel overwhelmed with the suffering in the world. But I know how to see it as part of a collective anger and a collective despair that has been transmitted to me by my ancestors, the ancestors of my body, my blood ancestors, who mostly came from Europe, my spiritual ancestors, which are not only the Buddha, but also my Christian ancestors, and also from my land ancestors, the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. So all of that suffering has been transmitted to me, to this body, this mind, body-mind construct. And with mindfulness, I can see that. I can free myself from this idea that I am a separate individual, this narrow view of ourselves that we tend to be conditioned into by our family and society, by advertising, by our thinking our life is about figuring out what we like and what we don't like, just making a list, and then spending our lives trying to find what we like and trying to avoid what we don't like. So from these very simplistic and not very helpful notions, we're able to look deeply and see that we are part of a collective consciousness, and that this body is like a wave on the surface of the ocean, manifesting. And sometimes the wave goes up, and the wave also goes back down into the water. And we can have fear of our own death, that when the wave collapses back into the water, that we will no longer be who we are, that we will cease to exist. But when we practice to see that our true nature is water, that the up and down of the wave is just a manifestation, then we don't have so much fear anymore. And we can learn to do what we really need to do to transform the suffering, to really bring healing to this intergenerational trauma which we've inherited. So this is a new word, intergenerational trauma. And every word is just a reinvention of past words. Our language is just a continuous evolution of creativity. And we find new ways to express the suffering and also the way of transformation. And in the Buddhist tradition, we always look for the language of our time in order to transmit how to heal and how to transform. And that is the language of our time. We talk about intergenerational trauma. Maybe we can listen to the sound of the bell and just come back to our body, come back to our mind, let go of all of our thinking and of who I am or who I want to be. Just see what is going on in our body, in our mind, in this present moment. I'm very grateful to a few of my younger monastic brothers. They had decided to fast this spring. And if you know a bit about our teacher's life, he also used fasting both to heal himself and also to respond to a situation of injustice going on in the world, especially in his country, in Vietnam. And in 1963, when the Buddhist community in Vietnam was banned by the Diem regime from displaying Buddhist flags on the Buddhist birthday, many Buddhists rose up, and there was a movement. It brought the community together in protest of this restriction. And many of us had observed the image of one of Thay's older brothers immolating himself in the streets of Saigon, the Quan Duc. And Thay fasted for many days in New York City. At that time, Thay was teaching at Columbia University, the Union Theological Seminary, and Thay's monastic brother asked him to come back to Vietnam to help because it was too much for him. The Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a great leader at that time in the Buddhist community, it's too much for him. He needed Thay to come back and help. And so Thay trained us also to use fasting to help us to clear our minds. And so as novices, we read it's good once a year to practice fasting. And I did when I was a novice, but somehow over many years I lost that habit. I would usually not eat dinner in the monastery, so I could sleep with a kind of more clarity, wake up with not so much heaviness in the morning. But I didn't do any multi-day fasts. And I don't know, certain conditions came together, and so I felt, oh, this is something to do. So after our BIPOC retreat this May, I practiced a 7-day water fast. And I found that most every day images from the situation in Gaza came up in my consciousness. I don't think I have to tell many of you that Gaza is now a kind of hell on earth. There's something like less than 3 or 2 liters of water per person per day. Very difficult to get clean water. Almost unlivable situations. And sometimes 70 or 80 people are reported killed every day, going on, including now. And college campuses, including the ones we were at this spring in April, Harvard and Dartmouth, where we were teaching, where students were rising up and being arrested to try to get the powers that be to do something about the situation, how to stop this violence from unfolding. And so as I was fasting, I was sitting with the hunger of my fast, but also the hunger in the collective. Single-handedly, the situation in Gaza is destroying the Millennium Development Goals the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations for food security. And I practice looking deeply into this conflict, as many of us are doing. Especially looking at it as a product of unhealed intergenerational trauma. And so I don't want to get into, a historical lesson that is for each of us to do on our own. That is what we do in our practice of looking deeply. But I know that we are all together in wanting to end this violence and find a path of healing. We know, as Thay reminded us over and over again during the war in Vietnam, that it is our brothers, our sisters, our own siblings that we are killing over there. It is not something or someone other than our own dear brother or sister. So in the practice of looking deeply, we are not allowed to discriminate. And that is sometimes difficult, because it's so much easier to blame and point fingers. And when there's a situation of violence, it's usually the easiest to blame and point fingers. And so in my practice of looking deeply, I practice to see that the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are not driven only by hatred. They live together, work together, fight together, which brings a powerful camaraderie. And some of us in this audience have been in the military, and we know that kind of strong sense of camaraderie, of siblinghood that happens in a military training unit that has been known for centuries and continues to be a powerful force today. So the IDF acts together to confront an enemy attack on what is most dear to them. When I became a monk, it was a time in my life when I had been experiencing so much depression. Early in my early 20s, and I didn't know a way out. But I had so much anger about the geopolitical situation. My eyes had been opened by reading history, and I could not shut them anymore. And yet the suffering was so overwhelming, and the implication of real guilt growing up as a white male in the United States of America is overwhelming. And I didn't know how to handle it. And so when I discovered meditation, it brought me a way to transform my suffering. So I was able to go in and look in my own body, follow my breathing, and touch joy for the first time in many weeks or months, when I was in a situation of deep depression. And I felt my body transforming. I felt my body and mind coming alive again. And it was not because of an idea. It was not because of something outside of myself, some sense pleasure, which had been, until that point, the main source of my happiness and joy, as far as I knew it. I needed to have something, some food, some romantic partner, some affirmation of my own self-worth in order to feel joy and happiness. And yet that joy and happiness was just very brief. And yet with this practice of meditation, I found a lasting way to bring ease to my body, to bring joy, to bring life back. And so I knew that this training was something I desperately needed. And so I put it into practice right away in every aspect of my daily life. I was not committed to a job. I'd worked a number of jobs out of college, but nothing that tied me down. And so I had the space and time, thanks to the support of my family, to practice meditation and try it out and train myself. And I saw joy coming back, and I saw that this Dhamma, this mindfulness practice, which we call the Dhamma. Dhamma means support. It can also be translated as justice, but it's a kind of supportive justice, not a punitive justice. That this way of living, this just way of living, was all I needed. And whatever came my way, I didn't need to worry. I just practice. I just practice the Dhamma. And if I tell you quite truly, that is what I've done until now. That was about 23 years ago. And I just keep to that deep insight. When I suffer, I practice, I come back to the Dhamma, I come back to my breathing, come back to my body. I look at the suffering directly and I shine the light of mindfulness on it. And I see that it changes, it transforms. And I come to understand its root in my thinking, in my way of acting, my way of speaking. And I can change the situation and bring in more peace and happiness. And I'm a much happier, peaceful person now because of that. And I could not ordain right away. I still had some school loans to pay back, but when I was living in a Zen center in New Haven, one day the towers of the World Trade Center were hit by planes. And for those of us who were alive at that time and remember, we remember the collective anger that spread. Thay's book, Anger, had just come out, and it became a bestseller. I encourage you to read that book. It's called Anger. And so for those of us who remember that anger, then maybe we can understand better what is happening in the war between Hamas and Israel. Because our practice is for us to have compassion and understanding. And for true understanding to take place, we have to free ourselves from our habitual ways of thinking, which are very dualistic, good and bad, right and wrong, black and white. You can put whatever word there you like, but our mind has this habit of comparing two things. We put two things up, just like that. And then we look at one and we say, oh, that's good. And we look at the other, oh, that's bad. And then all we need to do is get rid of all the bad things. And life will be good. And we learn quickly that it doesn't work like that. That in the bad there is the good. And in the good there's also the bad. And then, but that's not easy to accept because that's makes everything overwhelmingly complicated. Everything is interconnected. We say everything inter-is. Thay coined the word interbeing to describe this nature the interbeing nature of good and evil, the interbeing nature of right and wrong, the interbeing nature of you and me. We cannot be by ourselves alone. We can only interbe with the entire cosmos. And so an act of violence, an act of hatred is also our own act of hatred and violence. And so by practicing meditation, we are engaging in a real kind of transformation that is not only happening at the individual level. Those of us sitting here in this hall right now, we are part of a collective experience of transformation. This calm, this energy we are generating, this mindfulness energy is actually going out into the world, into our communities, into our families, into our homes, and transforming the situation. And that is not just at the level of our belief. We can observe that. The monks and nuns, we observe that in our own families. Even if our families don't consider themselves to be mindfulness practitioners, they are somehow transformed by our path. They are transformed by our deep commitment. And even those, not only those of us who are monastics, but also those of us who are lay practitioners. And so what we are doing here is real engaged intergenerational transformation. You can listen to another sound of the bell. Practice to see all of our ancestors in this body. Our ancestors of blood, our ancestors of spirit, and our ancestors of the land. So in my meditation, while I was fasting, I also looked into the situation in the Palestinian community. And I saw that the same is true of Hamas. I cannot say that they operate merely through some kind of cruel calculation, motivated by greed for power or some such thing. If it were, it would be so easy to put them in one category or the other. But I cannot accept such a simplistic way of looking at things. So there is a shared sense of experience that drives them to act in the way that they do. A deep camaraderie. So in the war in Vietnam, Thay worked when he went back to his country in 1963 to build a third force. He and his friends, they called it the third force. It is the force which is speaking for those who don't have a voice in the conflict, those who are speaking for peace, who want peace. who want an end to the violence as soon as possible. They are not for the North or the South, for the communists or the capitalists. They want peace, and they want the violence to end. But they saw that it's not enough just to want something. You need to train ourselves. And Thay was very inspired by what he saw in the black community in the South, by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the nonviolent resistance movement that he and many others spearheaded in the segregated South of the United States at that time. And along with some of his other friends, they wrote letters to world intellectuals to gain support for this third force movement in Vietnam. And Thay was the one to write to Dr. King. And eventually Thay was invited to come back to the United States, ostensibly to teach Vietnamese Buddhism at Cornell University, but actually Thay knew that he could be a voice for those who had no voice, for this third movement, third force in Vietnam. And so in 1966, Thay came back. And thanks to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Thay spoke out for peace in Vietnam, and thereby made a lot of enemies. Enemies on the South and enemies on the North. And Thay learned that he was no longer welcome to come back to his own country. Thay became a stateless person. Thay was cut off from his own movement, his own sangha, his own community. And it's very, very painful. But thanks to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is an organization working for peace, with a spiritual root, Thay met Dr. King in person in Chicago. And they did a press conference together, and Thay reminded Dr. King of the letter that he had written him and gave him another copy in case he knew that Dr. King probably got a lot of correspondence. And King was very impressed. In that letter, Thay explained why the Vietnamese monks and nuns and others were burning themselves in order to speak, to communicate to the world the situation, the pain and suffering that was being caused by ideologies outside of their country in Vietnam. And Dr. King was very moved by what Thay said. And Thay said to Dr. King that in Vietnam they call him a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a kind of someone who works to save other living beings, many, many living beings. And Dr. King had never heard that word before, so Thay had to explain it. Bodhisattva. And when Thay left, one of King's assistants handed him a note that Dr. King had written. And that note, in that note he expressed how much he loved Thay and wanted to work to help the situation. And we know that after that, Dr. King came out strongly against the war in Vietnam. And that had very powerful repercussions on the United States and on Dr. King's own life. So these are two brothers coming together and transmitting the energy of their ancestors, the ancestral suffering, and as well as the ancestral path of healing, the path of transformation that Dr. King and his colleagues had developed of nonviolent resistance, really how to build a nonviolent army with the same kind of camaraderie of a violent military army. Because I think nothing less is required to truly transform a situation of war, of conflict. You need to have that, what both Thay and Dr. King called true brotherhood and sisterhood. What we now, call siblinghood, to be inclusive. So that shared aspiration made them feel like brothers that had long known each other. And right away, and soon after that, Dr. King nominated Thay for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I encourage you to read that beautiful letter. I'd like to suggest that for the movement towards true peace and reconciliation to have any true impact in this world, we need to come together, we need to learn to live and train together. And that is what we are doing here at Deer Park Monastery. We have a day of mindfulness like this. We are so happy you could come for the day. And this is giving you a taste of what we are doing here with our monastic training, with our long-term lay residents. And this is an everyday experience, not just a one-day experience. We leave our lives behind. We leave, for the monastics, we leave behind building our own family. We leave behind wealth. None of us has our own bank account. The monastics receive about $70 per month, so they can buy underwear and shirts and maybe some books, simple things. We are in training. It's a kind of non-violent army, but an army of without arms, an army of peace. The Buddhist training realized earliest in the form of the monastic community about 2,600 years ago was the best form that Thay found to transmit and raise a kind of nonviolent army that was living peace in every moment of daily life. So I don't say this to discount the value of Zoom sessions online, or writing letters and articles to call for a ceasefire as groups, as individuals. These all have their place. But it's our deep conviction that it's not enough. If we truly want to have effective nonviolent resistance to go deeply, to take deep root in the 21st century, we have to come together as a community. We have to learn to train together, and that takes some kind of sacrifice. It means giving up a lot of the things that we like. But the beauty of mindfulness practice is that we do it, we don't have to see it as a kind of sacrifice. The more we practice mindful breathing, the more we practice mindful walking, we see that those things actually, we don't really need most of them. Simple food is enough. We don't need to have our favorite kind of food every day. Few material possessions is enough. Many of the monastics, we have a laptop at our disposal. the young monks, they practice to use the computers of the community. And some of us, we carry a phone. That's the community's phone. And so but we train with these things. We learn that there's a danger that we could easily get carried away by sense impressions, by things that we see online, and get caught up in distraction and projects and things. Even projects to practice more mindfulness and help people practice more mindfulness can, I know from experience, can overwhelm us sometimes, and we lose our practice, lose our concentration, lose the deep purpose and deep meaning that we are creating together by living in community. So we live as simply as we can in order to continue to build the beloved community that Thay felt so deeply moved to continue after he heard about Dr. King's assassination in Memphis. And that is what we are doing until now. And we are continuing. Our teacher has passed away in January 2022, but as I shared earlier in the talk, we were trained by him to see ourselves only as waves on the surface of the ocean. And Thay is also a kind of wave, very big wave, but a wave that knows how to transmit its vital energy, its way of training and practice to the other waves that follow. And we are all part of those, we are all those waves continuing Thay's, we say Dhamma body. And Thay always reminded us that we can only do it as a community. I think he also learned that from Dr. King. Without the beloved community, we cannot bring about real healing and transformation. So, building a movement means we have to live together, breathe the same air together, share a living space together, eat together, and also train together, share a sense of a deep aspiration together. These are the things that bring strong harmony to a community. The Buddha already saw these qualities 2,600 years ago. And if we want to look deeply into how to bring about an end to the destruction that we observe in the Middle East, then we have to see that it takes training. If the military groups causing the destruction are training, how can those of us who want peace expect there to be transformation of the violent situation unless we also come together and train? And that is what we are doing every day here. And that also is doesn't have to be so serious. This is a serious Dhamma talk. And some of my brothers are very good at making a lot of laughter in the Dhamma talk, but I knew this was going to be difficult in this Dhamma talk. But this is we don't have to see it as a kind of morose, painful way. It's a joy to live in community. Here the monks and nuns, they play volleyball together. They do rock climbing. They go on outings together. Tomorrow, the monks and nuns, they're going to visit the house of a few of the monks that live nearby, like house visitation. This is something we do when we go to Vietnam during the Lunar New Year. And it's a kind of joyful way of bringing one of the greatest blessings in Vietnam is to have many monks and nuns show up at your house. It's like you won the lottery. It's better than winning the lottery. It means you have blessings on your house for many generations. And so some of our young brothers, they went to Vietnam for the first time this spring at the Lunar New Year, and they observed that, and so now they invited the monks and nuns tomorrow to go visit their houses in Orange County. And they don't have a Vietnamese background, but they can see the beauty of that practice. And their families can see it too. So there's a lot of joy in this kind of practice. And just like when people in Montgomery, Alabama, walked, the black community boycotted the bus system. They walk with joy. Or the freedom riders, despite the beatings, sang songs of joy. Or even walking from Selma to Montgomery, there was joyfulness in the multiracial community, despite the fear. So that joy can also is essential for this kind of nonviolent training. We have to, otherwise it cannot be sustainable. But it's a joy to let go of those things we don't need in our life. Mindfulness helps us to see that it's not a great sacrifice. So we are building a multifold Sangha here at Deer Park. And that's a great joy. It's not only monastic. Like we're building a community where we can train together as monastics or as lay practitioners. So this community is growing and growing fast. Some of you might notice later today, the monks' residence, we are running out of space for all the monks that are ordaining. It's already the foundation is now laid, and framing will start this week. And that residence will be filled by the time it's finished with new aspirants who are ordaining. Good friends of ours, inspired by this view to live and train in meditation together, have bought land nearby so that we can have places for long-term lay community, maybe even a school, so that children can be trained, raised in this way of looking at the world that can bring peace to their own lives and to the world. So people are putting their lives and their pocketbook where their heart is. And that is so meaningful. So we are building just in this little valley around the mountain, a beautiful community of resistance that stands unequivocally for peace, for looking deeply into the heart of conflict and suffering to understand its root. So we know that we need to end this violence in Gaza and the Middle East now. And we know that it will take generations to heal the trauma that's already been inflicted on all sides of the conflict. In the Plum Village tradition, when I first came to ordain as a monk in the south of France in 2003, it was right before the first Palestinian-Israeli retreat. And since then there have been many retreats, first led by our teacher and then led by the monastic community to bring some of those small representative group of those who have been involved in trying to help to bring peace about on both sides of the conflict. And I'm very certain that there are less who have died, less pain and suffering because of those retreats. But we don't have the quixotic view that it will bring a total end to the conflict. But that doesn't for a moment stop us in our path, our work. So we continue that work together in Plum Village, at Deer Park, and all of our lived communities around the world. So to end this talk, I'd like to just remind everyone that the Buddha was enlightened and living, and yet wars went on around him. I don't think for a moment that the Buddha was awakened and built a Sangha and then all the violence stopped. But I invite you to reflect on how many thousands of wars and conflicts and acts of mass violence were avoided in history thanks to this practice, to this tradition of nonviolent training and healing, which has gone on for 2,600 years. We don't know about those conflicts because they didn't happen. Because enough wise people with a deep practice of nonviolence were able to stop the hatred, stop the killing before it started, at the root. And so when we see the violence going on now, we have to look and think with the long view that we are building a future together. It will not be possible for us to stop all violence that is going on in our lifetimes, but we can stop the wars which have not yet started by healing this intergenerational trauma. That is the work of true healing and transformation. And you don't get credit for it. You might not get your name on the peace treaty. You almost certainly will not. So it happens without name or form, through our own practice, through our own transformation and healing. And I see this as a kind of positive, constructive, creative nonviolence, just like that advocated by Dr. King. So we leave behind words of hatred and blame. It's too simplistic to blame like that. We need to move beyond the idea of an enemy. So I'd like to finish with a poem of our teacher. And maybe can help me to pass this out. Could you? Yeah. So in 1977, as I can give another. I'd like to invite Sister Hai Chu, Sister Shining Ocean, to come up and offer this song. It's a poem of Thay wrote in Singapore in 1977, when tens of thousands of people were leaving Vietnam in boats, sometimes mostly just fishing boats designed for the river, or just to go very close off of shore. They're going out into the open China Sea, into the Gulf of Thailand, and many of them were dying. And Thay was at the Asian Conference of World Religions, and he called on the leaders to, many of whom were unaware of the situation of these families floating in the Gulf of Thailand, dying from thirst, from lack of clean water, to help. And so they mobilized funds one rector of a Japanese university committed $60,000 of his university funds for Thay and Sister Chan Kong to commandeer a number of boats, which then went out to save the people in the fishing boats, the boat people. And Thay would go every day in a helicopter, flying above the Gulf of Thailand, finding where boats were in distress. Some of the boats had landed and were pushed back out to the sea. They were not accepted by the countries on which they landed. And so Thay was in a very tricky situation because Thay was in Singapore, and he knew that what he was doing was not legal. But he did it to save, he and his colleagues, they saw that sometimes the law, we have to go beyond the law and do what is right in our hearts. And Thay, in the nighttime, some refugees, they landed and they climbed over the wall of the French embassy and then were found there in the morning. And Thay knew that once they were in the embassy walls, they could not be pushed back out to the ocean, and that they would be arrested and then eventually, but they would be safe. And so this poem was written to the French ambassador of Singapore, who was able to give rise to a heart of compassion and look beyond what Thay called the iron mesh of the law. So in Vietnamese, it's called Building a Bridge, but I did a translation of it recently. I call Festival of 1,000 Stars. So I'll read in English, and Sister Hai Chu will sing in Vietnamese. There's a parasol tree on which the phoenix alights. Someone stands there, offering love from deep within, as laws which so often serve as an iron mesh imprison people in a cycle of torment. But compassion, like the hand of the Buddha, breaks hell and shatters sorrow. This morning, the city is bathed in vast sunlight, with doves soaring high in the sky. I think of you, your steadfast heart, and your cool, soothing smile, like miraculous water. Children miss their loved ones, like flowers yearn for the sun, like water longs for its source, like the moon misses the stars. Once our heart is resolved, violence holds no fear. Braving storms, we step into life, spanning the depths of hell to heaven's heights with a bridge to host a festival of 1,000 stars.
Có cây ngô đồng cho chim phượng đậu, có người đứng đó cho tình thương sâu. Luật lệ nhiều khi như màng lưới sắc, giam người trong kiếp trầm luân thương đau. Nhưng lòng nhân ái như bàn tay Phật, phá tan địa ngục, đập nát u sâu. Thành thành phố sáng nay nắng lên bát ngát, có chim bồ câu bay liêng trời cao. Tôi nhớ tới người tấm lòng cương trực, nụ cười mát dịu như nước nhiễm màu. Trẻ thơ nhớ người như hoa nhớ nắng, như nước nhớ nguồn, như trăng nhớ sao. Tâm đã quyết rồi hiếm gì bạo lực, thân đi vào đời cưỡi trên ba đào. Bắc một cây cầu từ hang địa ngục lên tới cõi trời mơ hội ngàn sao. Có cây ngô đồng cho chim phương đậu, có người đứng đó cho tình thương sâu. Luật lệ nhiều khi như màng lưới sắc, giam người trong kiếp trầm luân thương đau. Nhưng lòng nhân ái như bàn tay Phật, phá tan địa ngục, đập nát u sâu. Thành phố sáng nay nắng lên bát ngát, có chim bồ câu bay liêng trời cao. Tôi nhớ tới người tấm lòng cương trực, nụ cười mát dịu như nước nhiễm màu. Trẻ thơ nhớ người như hoa nhớ nắng, như nước nhớ nguồn, như trăng nhớ sao. Tâm đã quyết rồi hiếm gì bạo lực, thân đi vào đời cưỡi trên ba đào. Bắc một cây cầu từ hang địa ngục lên tới cõi trời mơ hội ngàn sao.